The Soviet Union, a country which made up a sixth of the world's landmass, possessed one of the largest economies and militaries in the world, and whose population was home to an enormous number of ethnicities and nations. Well, that collapsed almost overnight. But how on earth did this happen? This is my final part of my videos on Russia's 20th century, and it's going to cover the Brezhnev Era, the rise of Gorbachev, and the fall of the Soviet Union. To pick up where I left off, Khrushchev gets kicked from power in 1964, and the man who replaced him was Leonid Brezhnev. He was one of the major generals during the Second World War, and he worked his way into Soviet politics. Let's just say he wasn't as fun as Khrushchev, and the people who made up his government were all dinosaurs of the Communist Party and were very conservative. He was pragmatic in his policies, and there was very minimal change to the political and economic system in the Soviet Union. The Brezhnev era is of course famously known for its economic stagnation. The Soviet economy did pretty well in the early 1970s from a global oil crisis, which hiked up the price of their biggest export, but after that all settled down, the economy was really bad. Consumer spending was low, no one was productive, and so much money was getting pumped into the military, which didn't actually produce any benefit to consumers. To make matters worse, politics in the Soviet Union was full of corruption. The political elites, known as the nomenklatura, and their families, well, they had special privileges in society that really pissed off ordinary people. Does someone say Animal Farm? But let's take a look at foreign affairs. Just like Hungary a decade before, a revolution breaks out in Czechoslovakia in 1968, in what was known as the Prague Spring. This was a movement calling for the liberalization of the economy and for democracy, with their slogan, socialism with a human face. Again, this was a massive screw you to the Soviet model, and same old story, the USSR sends in the tanks and brutally crushes the revolution. This forms the foundation of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated that the Warsaw Pact had a duty to intervene anywhere where socialism was threatened. But on the other side of the world, Brezhnev actually did pretty well with the USA. With China turning against the USSR, Brezhnev decided to patch things up with the USA in a period known as détente. Nixon's visit to Moscow in 1972 resulted in the signing of the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty and the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which was a big step in the right direction. But all good things must come to an end, and relations started to break down towards the end of the 1970s. Something that the Soviets weren't too great at was a little thing called respecting human rights. Literally any dissenters to the Soviet regime were treated as enemies of the state, whilst in the West they were treated as heroes standing up to Big Brother. But the tipping point in détente came when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. So Afghanistan at this time was very unstable. There was a socialist revolution in 1978, and its new government led by Hasifullah Amin was reforming the country very rapidly, alienating the traditional Islamic thinkers in the country. Internally, Afghanistan was on the brink of a civil war. The Soviets feared that this instability could spread to some of its Muslim-majority republics and encourage separatist movements there. They also suspected that the Afghan government was aligning itself with the West, so in their eyes, Afghanistan was a massive security risk right on their southern border. So the Soviets planned to go in and replace the Afghan government with a pro-Soviet one. But there is a reason why Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires, and as this conflict dragged on for nearly a decade, it pretty much turned into the Soviet version of the Vietnam War. The USA saw this invasion as direct Soviet expansion into the Middle East, and even Jimmy Carter, who seemed like a pretty chill guy, well, he absolutely lost it, and the Cold War really starts to heat up going into the 1980s. A few years on, and Brezhnev gets old and dies. Then someone takes over and dies. And then someone else takes over and dies. Then we get Mikhail Gorbachev, who is like a breath of fresh air in Soviet politics, because he wasn't going to die. Gorbachev introduced some pretty big reforms into the USSR. One was perestroika, meaning restructuring the Soviet economy, and this planned to reduce centralization and give managers more freedom and autonomy. There was also a big shift away from focusing on heavy industry, and instead focus shifted to consumer goods which could improve the lives of ordinary people. You may not get political rights, but at least you get new iPods. Speaking of political rights, Gorbachev wanted to address this as well. In 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurs, and this completely reveals the incompetence of communication in the Soviet Union. There was a massive cover-up, and people in the USSR literally got the information about the nuclear disaster from Western news sources, which was a pretty big deal. This was a tipping point for Gorbachev, and he knew that he needed to act now and quickly. He introduced a policy called glasnost, meaning openness, and this meant relaxing censorship and democratizing the Soviet Union. As Gorbachev once said, "We need glasnost like we need fresh air." State censorship of news was relaxed, and eventually new political organizations and non-communists were a thing. And to top it all off, the first McDonald's was opened in the USSR. Imagine being the first Russian to try a McNugget. That's a badge of honor. In foreign policy, there's also massive changes, as Gorbachev told the leaders of Eastern Europe that the Soviet Union will not intervene in their internal development. I don't think anyone actually believed him at first, but by the late 1980s, some pretty awful regimes in Eastern Europe came tumbling down, and Gorbachev stayed true to his words and didn't prop up these failing communist governments. With the West, Gorbachev starts to build dialogue with Ronald Reagan, and he ends the arms race in 1987 with the INF Treaty. He also withdrew troops from Afghanistan in 1988, and in the international image, Gorbachev was a hero. And the Cold War pretty much ended by the late 1980s, maybe into 1990, but the driving factor behind this was Mikhail Gorbachev. But back at home, things weren't so great. Glasnost and Perestroika were cooking up some trouble. By democratizing the Soviet Union, the Communist Party were losing their grip on power, and a very powerful anti-communist bloc led by Boris Yeltsin starts to gain influence. Then in the republics, ethnic and nationalist voices were getting louder and louder. But surely the economic reforms were doing okay, right? Wrong. Inflation was high and industrial output was falling, and if you're an econ bro, that's a big no-no. Gorbachev's reforms were undermining the entire system of the Soviet Union, and then all hell broke loose. All the republics, including Russia, demanded independence, and it looked like the Union was falling apart. So who doesn't love a good old-fashioned military coup? So in August of 1991, communist hardliners and the army detained Gorbachev, who was on a lovely relaxing holiday in Crimea. The plotters then sent in thousands of troops into Moscow and declared a new government and put the city on lockdown. In times of crisis, there was only one man who could save the day, and that man was Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin took to the streets and got on tanks and rallied thousands of Muscovites against the coup. This very poorly planned seizure of power soon fell apart when the soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. Ironically, the coup that was meant to keep the Union together actually ended up driving it further apart. Gorbachev got home from his pretty chaotic holiday and he's sidelined in politics, and Yeltsin is now the man in charge. In November, the Communist Party was banned and all the republics began to leave the Union. Kazakhstan was actually the last republic to secede from the Union, so technically for a couple of days, Kazakhstan made up the entire USSR. The Soviet Union was officially abolished on the 31st of December 1991, and thankfully, this is one of the rare cases in history where when an empire falls, there wasn't too much violence. So Russia becomes a country again, with Boris Yeltsin at the wheel. Yeltsin really wanted to implement a market economy, which means capitalism, but he wasn't actually allowed to say that because it was still kind of a dirty word in Russia. Let's just say his market reforms did not go so great, and living standards started falling even more. Unemployment was high, and a lot of crime and alcohol abuse followed. The 90s was a decade of extraordinary change and hardship in Russia, and as you can probably tell from Russia's 20th century, they've had their more than fair share of hardship. Anyway, politics was becoming increasingly turbulent, and there was never really a stable multi-party system. A large communist party still existed, and they wanted to get the band back together and reform the Soviet Union. This time they were going to be called the Soviet Reunion. That's enough dad jokes for today. But Yeltsin stays in power, and he starts to become more and more authoritarian. But how did he actually do this? Well, the Russian state was in some trouble, and some businessmen gave the government massive loans to bail it out. This handful of people, known as the oligarchs, gained considerable influence over Russia's resources, its media, and even its politics. And this is a problem that still exists today. Then in 1999, Vladimir Putin becomes prime minister, and yeah, the creation of the modern Russian state that we know today, and well, maybe not love. That's all for this video and the Russia series, and I hope you've enjoyed it. The next country I'm going to cover is Russia's good old friend, the US of A.